And well, welcome to the April, believe it or not. I don't know what it looks like at your house, but it looks more like maybe February here. Learning lunch. We thought it would be timely, given the fact that we are in the thick of the budget process, to do one of our periodic reviews and updates of 70 on 70. Now, Anthony did point out that my usual title for this presentation is actually a little inaccurate because we do actually try very hard to stick to an hour for these. So we're going to refer to this as 60 or so minutes on Chapter 70 today. I absolutely am happy to take questions. And the thing that if you walk away today with nothing else, the thing that I'd love for you to understand is that in this, as in everything else that MASC does, we are here to answer your questions. And so if you feel like you get lost, if you want to go through this with your own numbers, if you want to have me come out and do a presentation for your district, those are absolutely things that we're always happy to do. So please keep that in mind as we go through this. This is going to give a couple of different sort of district examples, but how this works for every district obviously is different because your numbers are different. And I think that that's an important thing for you to be keeping in mind as we go through. So, something that I think is important from the perspective when we talk about how school funding works in Massachusetts is that we've had public schools in Massachusetts for a very long time from an American perspective. And as my colleague Alicia would have you remember, we have the oldest public school in the country in Boston Latin, but we also have the oldest public school law in the country, which was passed by the what was then the Mass Bay Colony in 1647. And it actually does a couple of things that are important. Essentially, what it said is that as English settlement was moving across Massachusetts, as soon as there was any concentration of English settlement, that they were required to have a school. A smaller settlement had to have at least an elementary school, and then as it got bigger, you had to have what they would refer to as a grammar school, sort of the Latin school that would prepare white boys for Harvard College. But the thing that was revolutionary about it was that it actually provided a way for the local community to actually fund those schools. And even well into the 1800s and approaching something closer to our own day, the notion that there would be a general funding of education for the children in a community was a really different kind of way of doing things. And this was happening as early as the 1640s in Massachusetts. So something that I've started emphasizing in these presentations, though, is that partly maybe because Massachusetts did it so early, we got this sort of very local idea of how schools are funded, and we kind of never moved away from that. And that's unusual in terms of if you look at school funding across the country. I pulled this quote from a book that I read this past summer from Matthew Gardner Kelly on California school funding, but it's actually Fletcher Swift talking about Massachusetts in terms of how focused we are on the provision of public education being something that is done by the local community. And this continues to be true, really, even now in terms of, how we talk about how schools are funded, right? And again, I just want to emphasize that that's actually a little unusual, that isn't really necessarily, it's not really necessarily how we even say that we approach it in Massachusetts, though it does actually often work out that way. Now, the next document that matters in terms of how we fund schools is our state constitution, which, as you may know, is the oldest written, still functioning constitution in the world. It's also the first constitution in the country to have a section that outlines having public education, written by John Adams. And this is the section in front of you. I think it's a great section. I urge you to read it if you're involved in public education at all. But the part that matters from a school funding perspective is whose job it is to make sure that we have public school. And it outlines in the Constitution that's the duty of legislatures, which is the state legislature, the great and general court, and magistrates. And magistrates is the 1780 word for the executive branch. So the governor's branch of the state government and the legislative branch. And they're the ones who are supposed to be doing this. Now, what's a little interesting, keep in mind your Fletcher Swift here, is that the Constitution passes, but it doesn't actually change how we go about funding public schools all that radically for a very long time. The state does make different kinds of provision for public schools. There's not any kind of systemization, though, of how the state is ensuring that public education is adequately funded. And over the course of moving into sort of more recent days, a couple of things actually happened that kind of brought these things to a head. Massachusetts passed the first special education law, what we refer to as Chapter 766, which provided that every child, regardless of their need, would be required, the district was required to make sure that they had an education. At the same time, or actually shortly thereafter, I should say, Massachusetts also passed a law that we talk about a lot this time of year, Proposition 2.5, which essentially capped how much a local community could raise taxes without sort of going to extra kind of means. And as you would imagine, those two things came to a head and came into a clash. And so a number of school children, really, obviously the lawsuits were filed by adults, filed suit against the state, citing the Constitution and saying, okay, Massachusetts, you're supposed to be making this provision. And yet our local communities are unable to sustain public education the way that they should. And in 1993, the Supreme Judicial Court in Massachusetts found for the plaintiffs in a case known as McDuffie. McDuffie was a school child in Brockton. And what the SJC essentially said was, yes, this language that's in our state constitution is not just nice language. It's actually a thing that is supposed to be happening. And so the Commonwealth had a duty to provide this. So what ended up happening very shortly thereafter, because the legislature knew this was coming, is that the legislature passed something we talk about a lot in Massachusetts, actually, which is the Education Reform Law of 1993. But at ground, that was a school funding law. And part of what was in it was this language in Mass General Law, Chapter 70, Section 1, which says that the general court, the words that we all love to hear, subject to appropriation, will do two things. Assure a fair and adequate minimum per pupil funding through defining a foundation budget and through defining a standard of local funding efforts. So there's two halves to the equation that happen in that first section. Now, there's a lot of other things that are in Mass General Law, Chapter 70. Most of them have to do with school funding. We won't go through them today. But at ground, Chapter 70 is saying, here's how much it costs to educate a child in Massachusetts. And here's how we're going to figure out who's going to pay for it. Now, again, a fair and adequate minimum is what we're establishing here. So please keep that in mind as we go through. We're going to take the first question here first. And something that I think is important to remember is that the first question is you have to do that math first before you get to the who pays for it part. So please don't think as we're talking through this that anyone is deciding who's going to put those dollars in yet. The dollars are just, we're figuring out how many dollars we need to establish that adequate minimum before we get to who's actually providing those dollars, okay? So in terms of that, now I want you to remember we're having this conversation in April of 2025. That means that we are in the middle of implementing the Student Opportunity Act. Now, the Student Opportunity Act was signed in November of 2019 by then Governor Charlie Baker after it passed both chambers of the legislature unanimously after years and years and years of advocacy by school committees and superintendents and teachers and their unions and municipalities and many, many other people. What we are doing in the middle of this, so we're talking at this point in this spring about FY26. FY26 is the fiscal year that will start this July. That will be year 5 of the 6-year implementation of the Student Opportunity Act. Originally, it was supposed to be 7 years, but something rather major happened in March of 2020, which meant that we actually postponed implementation by a year. The legislature did step up and make sure that we're actually going to hit the schedule as scheduled rather than bumping it back a year. It does actually hit the major themes that were required by the Foundation Budget Review Commission, which is what SOA was responding to, which are health insurance. There's a separate inflation rate for health insurance. We'll talk about each of these as we go through. There's an in-district special education percentage that is rising over the course of these 6 years. Similarly, there is a goal rate for the dollar amount per pupil for English learners. And this is the big money. There's an increase in the dollar amount per pupil for low income students. Now, low income students, there was a major discussion and then overhaul in terms of how we support children who are living in poverty, and in particular, how those dollars then flow through to districts that have high concentrations of students who are living in poverty. So that is that's sort of the backdrop in which we then are talking about the foundation budget at this point. So the foundation budget is constructed first on a dollar amount per pupil by cost center, cost category, that then increases over time. These are the categories that are used. I think they probably look familiar to many of you. They're probably in some cases even how you divide up your budget in terms of cost center. And those dollar amounts per pupil then come together in what's known as the base foundation amount. For FY26, we're obviously here talking about the budget that was proposed by Governor Healy. We're not yet into the House, although I wouldn't be surprised if these stay the same throughout. These are the foundation budget rates that you have before you here. Do note that part of what's being included here through the SOA is that guidance and psychological services amount had increased for the first couple of years. So that dollar amount assumption went up a bit. You can see here that there continues to be a kindergarten half day because some of you still have those, and vocational is the highest, both because they have smaller class sizes and because of the equipment needs that are in those districts or programs. The base foundation amount per pupil then has added to it two things. One is a low income increment and one is an English learner increment. Now, in all three of these cases, we are talking about actual students that are actually sitting in your seats in October of the previous year. So when we're talking about fiscal year 26, which starts in July, we're basing that off on your student count that was in October of 2024. There's always going to be that 1 year lag in terms of your enrollment. But it is students who actually are designated by the district, and we'll talk about how in a second, in terms of they're actually a kindergartner, they're actually an English learner, they're actually low income, and so forth. So for English learners for FY26, these are the dollar amounts that are here before you. I would just call your attention to the fact that the high school one is the highest. That's also part of what has been sort of phased in through the Student Opportunity Act. These are increasing towards goal rates as well. Obviously, if you only have a student for that short sort of remaining period of time and you're attempting to make sure they achieve English proficiency, it's important that that actually be supported. And then low income, which again is the real big story in terms of the Student Opportunity Act, is again progressing towards goal rates that were in the SOA. You'll notice, I think, that it's particularly, it's progressive towards the end here in terms of the low income group 12. This is based on the percentage of students who are designated as low income in your school district. And we'll talk about what that means in a second. The other thing that I just want to highlight is by the time we get to full implementation in fiscal year 27, the group 12 will be equivalent to the middle school rate in the base foundation amount. So in other words, if you have, for a low income student, you'll have essentially 100% more funding calculated into the foundation budget. So what does it mean to be considered low income in Massachusetts in terms of school funding calculations? I walk through here some of the changes that have taken place since fiscal year 17. Some of this was in response to the expansion of the free lunch program during the Obama administration, which meant that we moved, first of all, most of the major cities, and then essentially everyone to direct certification. That means that students are included in other programs, state programs, and then there's a matching that happens of that student's name is in one of those databases. It gets matched with the department. There is a supplemental process that came through as part of SOA that for districts that feel that students would be qualified as low income but aren't enrolled in those programs, there is a way for a district to actually submit paperwork and have that happen. And again, this has been the process again as part of the Student Opportunity Act. So the Special education is in here as well. And as I mentioned, part of what's going on with the Student Opportunity Act is that we're seeing an increase in the percentage. And the reason the percentage matters is because special education is not actually based on the students that you have that are considered special education, that are receiving special education services, that are on IEPs, however you'd like to phrase that. It is an assumed percentage of your enrollment in total. So that is moving through the SOA to 4% for most districts. For vocational districts, it will move to 5%, and it's staying at 1% for out of district students. Now, this is based on a calculation of if every student that is in district special education were receiving full-time special education, it would be 4% of your student enrollment. That is based on 18% of your students receiving special education services. I am well aware of the fact that that isn't necessarily accurate in all districts. And this was hotly disputed even during the Foundation Budget Review Commission. The other thing I like to mention is that the Foundation Budget Review Commission, which by the way came out in 2015, said that even if the recommendations were fully implemented, the state would be under calculating special education by $600 million. And that, by the way, was 10 years ago. So keep that in mind when we talk about special education. These are the foundation rates for special education for FY26. I always show these after the percentages and why we explain it, because obviously these are the highest numbers that are included. And then the inflation rate. The inflation rate has been a bit of a hot topic over the last couple of years, and has been, an advocacy point of MASC and most of the other associations as well for the past number of years. I show you a history of it here to show you it's kind of bounced around a bit and even has been negative a couple of times. The piece that has mattered particularly over the last couple of years is the fact that the Student Opportunity Act actually capped the inflation rate at 4.5%. And because there were these increases in spending due to the pandemic federal funding, which was great, don't get me wrong, that meant that we hit that cap in FY23 and FY24. But what that meant is that the actual inflation was not being reflected in the foundation budget. And that has hit us hard in many districts. And I would say that a lot of the reason that you're seeing a lot of the headlines that you're seeing and maybe experiencing the tension you're experiencing in your own district is because of that. That, of course, inflation, of course, builds in every year. And thus we've lost that carryover for those couple of years that were there. The other thing that happened is because the inflation rate is based on state and local spending nationally, as districts slowed and as states and communities slowed their pandemic spending because they were running out of the federal aid, the inflation rate substantially dropped. And so as you see in fiscal year 25, it was 1.35. That's the current year. For next year, it's 1.93. The other thing I should mention, by the way, is that the health insurance rate is separate. That's part of the Student Opportunity Act. For fiscal year 26, it's 6.13. That's better than 1.93. However, it also, I suspect, doesn't necessarily reflect the rate that you're seeing in your own district. I know I spoke to a district yesterday where it was over 20%. So again, keep in mind, this is really one of the biggest impacts of the entire budget because it impacts the entirety of the calculation. And in terms of, things that we all share in common, the cost increases are obviously something that impacts every district. So from one year to the next, the things that change in your foundation budget are whatever you have for enrollment, how many kindergartners you have, if you have a different number of students who are learning English, those sorts of things. And then that inflation rate. The inflation rate, again, is one of the cruxes of this calculation. Now, with the Student Opportunity Act coming in, there's obviously these other changes that are happening too as districts move to, as the sections of the calculation move towards the goal rates. So I'm going to give you two districts that we're going to kind of follow through this. They're very different districts, but they give you a picture of what this ends up looking like. Not going to dwell on pieces of it, but know that this same story then applies to your own district, right? So Southbridge, one of the 3 districts that has been in state receivership here in central Massachusetts. High low income, they're actually economically disadvantaged group 12. Their foundation budget for fiscal year 26 at this point is $4.3 million. For the other district, I was just out in Central Berkshire a couple of weeks ago presenting to them. They're a regional school district, obviously largely rural, and their foundation budget for fiscal year 26 is $23 million. Note that they're just their low income group 8, obviously some differences in terms of what enrollment looks like. So keep in mind, now all we did was do a calculation at this point, but keep in mind that that's the minimum amount that you have to spend. Districts can and most do spend more than that. Okay, it's fair and adequate minimum, but we're also implementing a change, which means I think we've kind of agreed that it isn't really adequate, at least. We can talk about whether or not it's fair. So obviously, if enrollment matters, then knowing what your enrollment is and what has happened to it over time makes a difference. And so this doesn't go all the way quite up to now, but this is the Southbridge Public Schools enrollment over going back to 1995. They've have had some declining enrollment over that period of time. I mean, Southbridge is among other things is a mill town, but and obviously receivership and so forth like that can make differences as well in terms of these things. And then of course the other thing that matters is your selected populations, right? So how many students do you have that are English learners? There's been a substantial increase in Southbridge in terms of that. It impacts your foundation budget, also impacts your spending. Similarly, low income has particularly grown in Southbridge. And then students with disabilities, while it doesn't impact your foundation budget, since that's assumed, does really impact your spending. And if you notice in Southbridge for 24, it was about 27%. Now, similarly for Central Berkshire, like a lot of districts in the area of the state that Central Berkshire is, they've had declining enrollment for a number of years at this point. And then if you look at their selected populations, they've had low English learners, but not none. And we all know that that matters a lot. That services need to be provided for students that you have. Some pretty substantial growth in terms of low income students. And in terms of students with disabilities, a little bit of change, a little bit of growth, but not substantial. And they're actually right around what the state is sort of assuming as your average at about 18%. So if those are the pieces that go together to make your foundation budget, then this is what ends up then happening, right? So Southbridge has had declining enrollment, but has had increases in terms of the low income students. And then at the same time, of course, we've had the Student Opportunity Act increasing the per pupil for those low income students. And that gives you the result that you see in front of you for Southbridge. For Central Berkshire, keep in mind what their numbers look like. Oh dear, I did this the other way. We're going to all just get to watch it grow together. You can see here that it bounces around as things like income decline, as the student enrollment declines. And that means, and I've highlighted these in red, in some cases their foundation budget goes down from one year to the next, which we know their costs would not. But then they also have been impacted by the Student Opportunity Act being implemented because they're group 8, they have a substantial number of low income students. So if that's the first part of the calculation, then we need to figure out who's going to pay for it. And this is based, again, on standard statewide numbers. Remember that the whole deal of the foundation budget of Chapter 70 was supposed to be that we applied numbers to the entire state. Now that can be fairly daunting, right? How are you going to compare Boston and Beckett? How are you going to actually come up with numbers that somehow have a similar bearing on Worcester and Watertown? And so the state that has I'm going to be the first to tell you this, fairly complicated calculation, but it does apply to everyone. And it's based on a statewide calculation first. So the first thing that happens is that the state has agreed, I guess with itself, that of the entire foundation budget, 59% of it is going to be funded by local communities and 41% of it is going to be funded by the state. Now, this is frequently when people stop me and say, okay, but I thought you said that the Constitution said that the legislature and the magistrates were responsible for public education. That's true. There's a reasonable conversation to be had there. I would say that this is actually a good reflection of Fletcher Swift saying that Massachusetts also still has this focus on local funding. Be that as it may, please understand that that's underlying everything that then moves forward from this in terms of how we pay for things. So when the state does this calculation, it's actually going to be based on two numbers. One is the equalized valuation. This is what property taxes is, the short version of this. Please realize that it is taxable property because that matters. We have plenty of property in Massachusetts that's not subject to tax. And the other thing that it's based on is income taxes that obviously are paid from the state. Now, in both cases, these are numbers that are reported to the State Department of Revenue. That is what the state is then pulling from when it does the rest of this calculation. So when it comes to calculating local share, how much is our local communities going to be having to be responsible for funding their schools? If we take that it's going to have to be 59% of the entire foundation budget for the state, right? That's $90 billion, billion with a B, okay? Now that's the target. The thing is though, that the state also has established as a, well, first it was a tradition and now it's actually written into the law, that a maximum, that no community is going to be required to fund more than 82.5% of their foundation budget, regardless of their local ability to pay. The idea here is that everybody gets state aid regardless. So we're going to then apply that to the state number, right? So we're not taking the full 9 billion. We're going to take 82.5% of that. So if the not, sorry, take that, let me put that the other way. If we're going to take 9 billion, that's 82.5%. If it's 82.5%, what is it 82.5% of? Yes, we just had to solve for X. That's this $12.6 billion. That's the statewide combined effort yield. Again, if we're coming up with 9 billion and that's going to be what we're going to require, that's only 82.5% of something. It's 82.5% of this $12.6 billion. Okay, so somehow now we have to get to $12.6 billion. That's the combined effort yield, that's the sum. What we're gonna do is we're gonna get half of it from property taxes. We're gonna get half of it from income taxes. So we've divided 50-50 here, okay? And then we're gonna do some, what I think of as backward math. We know how much we have in terms of taxable, of the fair cash value of taxable property. We know how much we have in terms of coming in for income taxes. So how do we get from these numbers over to this 6.3 billion in each case? We solve for the decimal, okay? Now, the only reason I'm walking you through this is the thing that comes out of this calculation are these two decimals, which are then going to get applied to every single community in Massachusetts. And this is how the state says to very different communities, here's how much we think you can afford to spend on public schools, okay? Now, all of this matters because we do all of this calculation to then, once we figure out how much the local community can contribute, the space between that and the foundation budget is what your foundation aid is. Okay, that's where all of this comes from. So to walk you through a couple of examples, and I'm not going to read all the numbers here. This is what the state does to Southbridge. What is Southbridge's equalized property valuation? It's about $1.7 billion. We apply the decimal, the uniform property percentage decimal here, which is that 0.3, and we come up with a local effort just that's on property. We're gonna do the same thing with income, right? How much came in from Southbridge? They do this by zip code. We're going to use the same multiplier that we're, again, going to use for every community in Massachusetts. We get about $7 million. Those added together are Southbridge's combined effort yield. Now, the state, this is not going to matter for Southbridge, but it's going to matter for a lot of other communities. The state did say that no community has to fund more than 82.5% of its foundation budget. Well, it's kind of irrelevant for Southbridge because the Southbridge foundation budget, including its contribution, by the way, here to Bay Path Regional Vocational, because it's a member, this is the town of Southbridge, it's a member of that, is $48.8 million. Well, 82.5% of that is $40.2 million. Southbridge doesn't have that. It's got 12.7. So 12.7 is what we're going to then carry forward. And that's the target percentage contribution for the town of Southbridge to its foundation budget, that it's going to contribute 26.07%, okay? The percentage is what actually then gets carried forward because we're going to see in the next step that how close it is to 26.7 is actually what ends up being carried forward. So if you think of it in terms of, okay, so Southbridge has a foundation budget, how much is coming in locally? How much is the target for state contribution? This is really what the balance looks like for the town of Southbridge. Now, I'm going to give you one of the communities for a Central Berkshire Regional. A regional school district, we do the same calculation for every single one of the towns, okay? I'm picking here the town of Beckett, happens to be first in alphabetical order for Central Berkshire. Same decimal applied, right, to their property. Same decimal applied to their income. In the case of Beckett, their combined effort yield is $3.5 million, obviously very different scale. The foundation budget for the town of Beckett is $3.1 million. So their maximum local contribution is only 2.5 million. So in this case, that 82.5 is then what gets carried forward. Okay. And that becomes their target. Okay. So one of the things, by the way, if you're in a regional school district that I really want to strongly recommend that you do a comparison of is what I'm doing here, which is what is every town's target share? Because a lot of times those conversations get focused really strongly on enrollment. But remember, the state's calculation is actually underlined by essentially ability to contribute. It's not just your enrollment, it's also your ability to contribute. And I really recommend that you have a conversation about like comparing these, because I think sometimes we think we know the different levels of wealth and we don't necessarily. So this is where we get into the sort of brass tacks. Okay, so how much was Southbridge required to contribute last year, to go back to Southbridge? Last year, they had to contribute $10.6 million. Now, the state then also pulls another number, which is your municipal revenue growth factor. It's exactly what it says. It's how much your municipal revenue has grown in the previous year. In the case of Southbridge, it was 3.01%. Multiplies these two numbers together, and that actually gives your preliminary contribution. So in the case of Southbridge, it's just shy of $11 million. What goes into your municipal revenue growth factor? And this is another thing that I think is important to highlight this time of year. It starts with your 2.5 state imposed levy growth, but then it adds new growth, it adds state aid, and it adds the prior year local receipts. So when the state says, how much does your contribution to your local schools have to go up? It most of the time is going to be greater than 2.5% because your local revenue actually didn't only grow by 2.5%. And that's a conversation that doesn't happen very often. You can actually find your municipal revenue growth factor calculation on the Department of Revenue's website, and I'm actually also happy to send it to you. I'm showing you here Southbridge's. I'm not going to go through all of Central Berkshire's towns, but it actually walks you exactly through the entire calculation of how you get then to the municipal revenue growth factor. That then becomes your preliminary local contribution calculation. Okay. Really strongly recommend knowing that. I've also done some, tracking it over time. What does this actually end up looking like? Another thing that is healthy for regionals to do is to actually compare municipal revenue growth factors, because nobody's talking about those. And that also can give some perspective in terms of what contributions look like in a regional school district. So when we've done that preliminary contribution, then we say, okay, well, we had this target. How close are we? Okay. And if you're above target, the state reduces you to 100%. If you're below target, and let me say this, most places are, because foundation budgets have been growing because of the Student Opportunity Act. And that's a good thing, but they've been growing more than your municipal revenue growth factors are. So you're below target. That's not because you're bad. That's not because anybody did anything wrong. That just is because of how the math worked. Depending on how far below you are, you might be brought up a couple of notches here. And you can see the math here at the bottom in terms of how close Southbridge is and how far up it has to go. You'll notice that Southbridge ends up with a required local contribution of $11.1 million, which as a percentage of their foundation is 22.74%. You'll notice that's still fairly shy of their target local share, okay? That's the standard local funding effort. That's the whole calculation there. So if you take that and we're trying to get to your foundation budget, the way that we get to your foundation budget is we put in the required local contribution first, and then getting to foundation is your foundation aid. So in terms of Southbridge for this coming year, at this point, Their required local, so this is their foundation budget, is that yellow line just shy of $45 million. The required local contribution, again, we're now back to the K through 12. We've pulled out Bay Pass contribution, is just over $10 million. And then foundation aid is then going to get them to their foundation. Okay. It's a little bit more, I guess, fun. If you're a regional school district, I always think these look like a layer cake. Every town's local contribution comes in first. You can see the different enrollments here. Dalton by far is the largest of the enrollments in the district. Once those are all added together, there's Windsor. The state fills the gap with foundation aid to get them to foundation. Now, in terms of what it has looked like over the past couple of years, this is sort of, it's been an evolving story. What has happened to a community like Southbridge, right? So Southbridge, you could see from their numbers, not only has a high percentage of low-income students, but it's also a fairly low-income community. It doesn't actually have a large capacity to fund its schools. That, as I think we all know and understood when we passed it, was exactly the kind of place that was a target for the Student Opportunity Act. It was intended to provide greater support to those school districts. And I just want you to see, in terms of sort of the great difference SOA has made to a community like Southbridge for the past number of years. The yellow is their foundation budget. Blue is their local contribution. They are, in terms of capacity to fund, they're very low in terms of that. But their state aid has really come through. And sometimes I've seen some ways of telling this story that act like this is a bad thing, that most of the aid is going to X, Y, and Z. Most of the aid is going to the districts that have the highest numbers of low-income students and the least capacity to fund them. And in Massachusetts, and we don't like to talk about this, but it's true, we concentrate our low-income students in very few districts. That's not to say they're the only places that they are, but if you look at the entire enrollment of Massachusetts, which is about 1 million pupils, you can count on not many more than 2 hands where the vast majority of those kids who are low income go. And that is also where the vast majority of the state aid that's increasing through the Student Opportunity Act is going. And that's because that's how the law was written. And it's also, frankly, just because it's how we fund public education in Massachusetts, is we provide more support for people who need it more. Now, here's where the SOA implementation is, here in the red circle. Now, the story that I don't think is getting told, because the Southbridge, the Worcester, Pittsfield, name your gateway city story, I think probably is getting told. I showed you a headline from Commonwealth Beacon earlier that actually talked about that being the intent, is the districts that are low income that aren't gateways. Okay, so remember, Central Berkshire is group 8. That's a significant proportion of students who are considered low income. Central Berkshire was a district that actually was hold harmless. Now, I haven't mentioned hold harmless until now. It certainly has come up a lot this year. What happens in Massachusetts is if your state aid would be less, according to the calculation that we all have agreed upon, which is the constitutional mandate, then the year before, the state says, hang on, we're going to keep you at the same amount. And then the other thing that happens is that the state has agreed to actually add a per pupil addition increase. Okay. Now, please note that the constitutional standard is the foundation budget. Okay. So anything over that is the state saying things like, we understand that costs don't actually go backwards. And we're recognizing that with keeping you at the same level and then increasing. That was where Central Berkshire was for quite a while, because they had declining enrollment. So if you look at the places where the yellow bar is below the green, that's all hold harmless funding. That's money that was over their foundation budget, didn't have to do with the number of students they had, didn't have to do with the need of those students, didn't have to do with the local town's capacity to pay. It was that they would have gotten less aid than the previous year if the state actually stayed that foundation level. However, because the foundation budget has been going up, because they have as much need as they do, and honestly, partly because some of the towns don't have enormous capacity to fund, Central Berkshire is actually one of the districts that's out of hold harmless. And it came out of hold harmless actually right at the crux of when the issue was, which is fiscal year 24. And The other thing that I really think is important here is that there's a significant number of districts that would have been in the same situation as Central Berkshire had we had inflation rates in the past 2 years that we should have, essentially, that were not below 2%. There are districts that have been pushed back into hold harmless because the inflation rate is so low. And essentially what has happened is we put an enormous amount of time and energy and political capital into putting the Student Opportunity Act forward and getting it passed. Some of you might remember having it passed. I think the Senate, I think it passed 8 times before we got it through the House. That was a lot to do. And what happened is because the pandemic impacted our inflation rate and we then capped it, those didn't get carried forward. We then had a falling inflation rate. We essentially are sort of holding ourselves back. We're nullifying the impact of the Student Opportunity Act on so many districts in Massachusetts. And the one that I point to all the time, by the way, is Boston. Sometimes just people are surprised to learn that Boston is a hold harmless district. Boston has declining student enrollment, but it's also a very wealthy city. However, it would have been out of hold harmless in fiscal year 24 had we had an inflation rate that was more realistic in terms of its actual need. And that's not true everywhere, but it is true of many places. And I think that that's kind of the untold story here, is that the inflation rate is conflicting with the Student Opportunity Act. And one of them is, and the inflation rate is actually really holding back the impact of this maybe once in a generation, I don't know, change to the foundation budget. So I point you to Central Berkshire as an example of that. Now, we always say that we're only going to run for an hour. We do have, I haven't seen any questions coming in. I want to make sure I'm leaving space for that. I also did add a couple of slides here that maybe deal with some of the sort of hot button-ish issues that are happening, partly also because the Department of Elementary and Secondary Education released fiscal year 24 actual spending numbers yesterday afternoon, which meant I spent the afternoon adding some slides here. But I do want to pause for a second just to sort of say I'm happy to take questions on what we've already talked about, and also to give you a chance to say this is my to note that this is my email address, this is my cell phone number. I want you to make sure that you know that you can ask me questions about your district if you want to. Okay, so yeah, all right. So here's what I'm going to say. If you're going to ask about, like, can you give me a particular district? I want you to write down my email. I want you to send me an email because I'll do it. But I can't do it right now. Okay. And those are fair. And also send in things if you actually have questions on what we've actually already done. So, yep. How is a district in hold harmless? So let's actually trying to remember which of the slides that are coming up are the right ones to show you. So let's talk, I want to give you a couple of examples of what it looks like when a district's spending comes together. And then I have a couple of examples of what hold harmless ends up looking like after this. So because the state actually did just release actual spending numbers, I ran a couple of charts of actual spending numbers. I'd already done Central Berkshire's because they'd actually sent me their end of year report. Southbridge's I didn't have. Something that I think is important is we have this sort of, you know, the truth is that most districts spend more than foundation. But I want you to have an idea, again, in terms of that capacity to fund. So these are fiscal year 24 numbers. So not this year, but last year, right? We've got the local required contribution, foundation aid. In terms of what is the ability of a local ability of a town like Southbridge to fund, Southbridge funds just under $1 million, or did in fiscal year 24. So their foundation budget, their actual net school spending was something like 102% of foundation. That puts them very, very, very low in terms of where things are. I literally only cracked open the spreadsheet this morning, so I can't even tell you what the actual average is now. Last time I checked, it was about 29%. But I just want, again, like in terms of the places we're trying to reach, right? Southbridge is one of them. To give you a little bit of a more colorful picture, that was just the sort of reported net school spending. It did just those sorts of how much was required to spend, how much was local contribution. I actually have all of Central Berkshire's numbers. So in terms of what does your actual revenue picture look like when all comes in, this is a more colorful example, but gives you really what that picture looks like, right? Because the whole story isn't actually just local contribution and state aid. there's more to it than that. So we have, again, these are fiscal year 24. So remember last year, have the same array of towns here coming in with their local contributions. State puts in the foundation aid. Now then there's a whole bunch of other things that happen here, right? There's federal grants, there's state grants, they have circuit breaker reimbursement, they have federal nutrition funding that comes in. There's private grants that they had, and then there's additional local contribution here on top too. So if you put together the actual full revenue picture for your school district, you're probably going to end up with something like this. And if you add the grants, which don't count towards net school spending, every school district is going to be spending more than their foundation budget. Okay, just I want to acknowledge that because that actually is definitely part of the story. Now, here's a couple of slides that maybe talk a little bit more about that question of hold harmless. Okay, and I had some conversations with sort of some of the districts that are closer to me here in Central Mass and looked at that. Hudson's been making some headlines. Hudson's among the districts that are going for an override this year, and what I've done here is I've just zoomed in. So realize you're not seeing the whole required district contribution. Please note that this chart starts at $15 million, which I usually try to start my charts at 0, but I'm trying to zoom in here so you can see better. Here's the story in terms of that, right? So if you look at between fiscal year 19 and 20, okay, if what the state had done was just fund Hudson's foundation budget, okay, I think you can see the green that's sort of peeping up behind my call out bar that goes to the $315,000. The state would have given Hudson less state aid than the year before, okay? And that would get them to foundation, which is what the agreement was. But in particular, the legislature, but this is now part of the Student Opportunity Act, has put forward that actually we're never gonna push you backwards. Okay, we're always gonna say you get the same amount of state aid that you got last year. That's what hold harmless is. Hold harmless is your foundation budget is less, but you're still getting the same amount of state aid you got the year before. Now, to that, the state then adds a per pupil increment addition. Okay, so in the Student Opportunity Act, it's $30 per pupil. In the governor's budget for fiscal year 26, at this point, it's $75 per pupil. The trick, so that's where you end up with this. We're only getting an increase of $250,000, or we're only getting an increase, right? We're getting the minimum per pupil increase is the way that gets put. That means that your state aid is only going up by that small amount. Now, the trick is that you're still getting the same amount of state aid you got the year before. Then you're getting this small increase, okay? Now, if you stay relative to enrollment and local contribution at that level, you're going to then end up with even more of a gap between that amount of state aid and your foundation budget the next year, because it actually, the amount that you then had went up, right? It went up by that per pupil amount. That isn't what happened here with Hudson. Hudson's not a great example of that because they had a whole bunch of other things happening at the same time. But it is something that you can see with other districts. And it's then also how, in some cases, school districts get stuck in hold harmless. I just want to make sure that I'm actually looking at this. So let me give you, so then Marlboro is an example of a district that actually moved its way out of hold harmless, okay? And in this case, we're talking about how the Student Opportunity Act, which by the way, that's the recent policy change. For those who are looking for recent policy changes, it's the major revolution that we've had in school funding for the past 25 years. You can actually see exactly where the implementation of the Student Opportunity Act hit Marlboro, okay? So that's what's going on with this. Now, to give you an example of a district that has had this build up over time, Amherst, I've seen making some headlines out in the Pioneer Valley. This is Amherst, the town district. They regionalize at the high school level, and I've got a slide for that too. You can see here how the funding that they're getting, the state aid, everything that's in the green over the foundation budget, is increasing over time. So the gap between their foundation budget and the amount of state aid they're getting is getting bigger. Okay. Now, in every case, they're getting an increase in state aid. They're getting that per pupil increase. And that tends to be the thing that we see because we see how much our state aid gets bigger. What we're not necessarily always seeing is, okay, but how much of the state aid that we have is based on this agreed upon calculation of the level of need in the community and the level of ability of our local community to pay. And then what I did for, this is the regional district, similar kind of situation. What I just did this morning was I actually pulled Amherst Pelham, the regional district's calculation, and then their actual spending, because I think it tells an interesting story in terms of how this ends up looking. So regional school district, same kind of setup you saw with Central Berkshire, right? The local required contributions go in, state gets you to foundation. Foundation in the case of green, in the case of this is actually the yellow line, right? Just on top of the $9.5 million in foundation aid. However, if Amherst only got that, they would be getting substantially less funding because, again, they've had this happen over time than they got in the year before. So Amherst for fiscal year 24 got $5.4 million in hold harmless aid. Now to that, much like many other communities, the local communities contributed more. And I pulled the numbers just to see what it looked like. That was $7.7 million. Now, this is without grants. This is just local contribution and state aid. But that gives you an idea then of what sort of the revenue picture looks like if it's just the state aid and the local contribution. Now, I'm going to open up the questions and I'm going to go through them all and see where we are at. Okay, so if you want to look at your own personal calculation, please send me an email. So I'm gonna say that I'm gonna click answer live to all of those. Recent policies changes, that's a Student Opportunity Act and how Hold Harmless is working on this. Trying to get up to speed. I think, Jeff, this is kind of it. But I'm happy to walk you through any parts of this that you want to. It is a lot of information. So, and we understand that. That's also partly why we actually record these. For municipal revenue growth calculation, how would you facilitate a local conversation? I mean, I think the first thing, and I've presented to a couple of FinComs on municipal revenue, like on doing this presentation, but calling out the municipal revenue growth factor. I think the first thing is actually just kind of daylighting the fact that the municipal revenue growth factor exists, because I think it answers an implicit question that often gets raised this time of year, which is how come our required contribution is going up more than 2.5%. And I think just even revealing the fact that the Department of Revenue is starting with the 2.5% and then adding these other things, I think is a really important thing just to make sure people know. Alyssa, I think that's probably also part of your question in terms of, how do you actually have this conversation locally? Now, part of it is, of course, we know that the willingness on the municipal side to have these conversations varies widely across the state. I have recently, I guess, been experiencing more positivity in terms of being willing to at least understand where the numbers come from, because I think that from the town side, it can feel like they already feel like they don't control what the school does with their money, which is how school committees work. But then they also feel like they're getting the state's telling them that they have to spend a certain amount of money. And in many cases, they don't have any idea where that comes from. And I think that's a fair criticism. So I think that may also be an answer to this, is that, even just revealing where the calculation comes from is probably that too. Jen, can you give me a different phrasing of your question in terms of changing the way your town uses Chapter 78? I'm going to answer what I think your question is, but then I want to make sure that I've got it. So one of the objections that sometimes happens in communities is if, like Amherst, you see here, or most other places, your town contributes more than it's required to. If through the state aid process, the amount of Chapter 70 aid that you're getting goes up, the town doesn't always give you that increase because they're not required to. They're already funding you more than they're required to. And that then becomes this sort of tussle. And I think that, first of all, understanding, I know that I am I'm a dyed in the wool believer that better understanding leads to better conversations, obviously. But I do think that understanding where those calculations come from, right? So if you're a minimum aid district and you're hoping that they're going to go from $75 per pupil to something else, you also though want to make sure you actually get that, right? You will need to have that conversation with your town now. Don't just go talk to your legislator about that. You need to say, hey, if this increase comes through, we want to see it. Because for the overwhelming number of districts that are getting minimum per pupil are also well above required net school spending, and well over not just net school spending, but required over local contribution. So they don't have to give it to you, right? Unless you're a regional school district, in which case you just get your state aid. But if you're a municipal district and you're getting, right, and they're funding you more than they have to, um, they're going to have all the state aid work out whenever we get a state budget, which probably is going to happen maybe in July, maybe August. And they're going to say, we gave you what we had to, we're not going to give you more. So, I mean, I think the fact that, you need to make sure the conversations are happening in both places. If you're going to go talk to your legislator and say, we need more state aid, you need to then say to the town, and we expect to get it. Now, I'm also going to say this, which I feel like is maybe I'm one of the only people who's in a position to be able to say this. Realize that minimum per pupil increases are not actually going to keep up with the cost of inflation. And I mean, MASC's position, MESS's position, everyone went and said, we want more minimum per pupil. I think partly because it's an easy thing to explain to people. What we really, I would say, from a calculation perspective need, is we need an inflation rate that's more reflective of what's actually happening in our districts, right? I mean, you saw what the inflation rates are. I've been in all kinds of budget hearings this spring. I have not heard, a level service budget that's coming in at 1.35%. Like it's just not happening. I've got transportation increases that in some cases are 30, 40%, special education increases that are, certainly well in the double digits, health insurance and so forth. So by the way, Deborah, I'm not going to answer your supplemental budget question. I think we probably need to send out something on that, and because I'm going to miss something if I try to do it off the top of my head. But so that I think also matters here in terms of being realistic as the people who make the allocation points, is that so long as that's what we're basing this on, we're not actually like our spending is going up by inflationary things. If we're doing per pupil increments as the way that we're trying to get there, we're not going to actually get there. It's not going to happen. Boo, 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 boo. Yes. Okay. So Jen, I did answer your question then in terms of that. Okay. Glad to hear that. Mississippi state average for what the per pupil over. Yeah. So Christy, I'm actually basing the spending over required on past years. I haven't actually even I literally opened the spreadsheet not even 3 hours ago. I haven't actually looked at that average yet. I will attempt to do something like send it out over the listserv or something if you're interested, or you can send me an email and I'll look it up. Put it into the general fund. It's not going to the school, but using this. Yes. So Jen, I think that probably what's happening is you're funded over net school spending already. And if you get an increase over the course of it. So, I mean, that's also one where this is when you have a conversation, you talk to your teachers and you talk to your parents and you say, look, we're fighting for this, but it needs to actually come to the schools in order for us to use it. Anthony, am I missing any questions? I want to be sensitive to time. So we are currently coming up on 1, which would be 1 hour. And we actually got through all of the slides, including the extra ones, which is kind of amazing. So I realized that for some of you, your lunch hour is ending. I want to be sensitive to that and say thank you for being here. If you have other questions, though, I'm certainly going to stay on and make sure that that we've gotten through everything that has happened. Facilitate local conversations or guide our research as we pull together our own data. I mean, I think I would send me an email for those who are asking about talking points or a series of questions. I think some of this is going to depend on your district, and your local ability to contribute. how much you're impacted by the Student Opportunity Act, where your position is relative to hold harmless. Like I went through these slides quickly, but something I think we need to be thoughtful about is we keep hearing these sort of statistics of 200 and something districts are in hold harm, are getting minimum per pupil, but that's not the same at all. Like you've got districts that are almost where Central Berkshire is, where if they got a better inflation rate, they'd be getting the gains of the Student Opportunity Act. You've got a handful of districts that are where Amherst and Amherst Pelham and Franklin and a couple of others are, in terms of that's really not their story. They're millions into hold harmless. You've also got districts that, you know, have had something happen just within the last year or so that sort of pushed them there, where they may well be coming back out. I mean, I think that generalizing about per pupil increases is not necessarily a useful way of advocating, because districts' reasons for being there are different, and the solution depends on your district, or the solution you need to be asking for, I guess I would say, depends on your district. And so I want to make sure that you've got the opportunity to sort of answer that question appropriately. Anthony, I think I've touched on all of these. Just want to make sure that I haven't seen anything else. Okay, I am good on questions. Very good. So again, my cell phone and my email address not only were here, but they're also on the MASC website. I'm always happy to talk to you about your own district, and to, you know, to try to give you the best information possible. While my April is a little full, certainly can come do presentations in school districts, and invite your FinCom, invite your select board, like make this a greater conversation, because I think that the more people who understand this, the better off we all are. And I'll end on that note. Thanks.